Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. The United Nations has warned that the war in Syria is increasingly splitting along sectarian lines, with fighters from no less than 29 countries joining the rebellion against Bashar al-Assad. The UN report this Thursday has further intensified fears of regional destabilization. And to share his thoughts on that and other aspects of the conflict in Syria, I'm joined today by Peter Harling. He's the project director for Syria, Egypt and Lebanon for the International Crisis Group, which is based in Brussels. Hello and welcome to you. I'd like to start first, Peter, by listening to the rapporteur for that UN report, Paolo Pinheiro, talking about this jihadist dimension in Syria.
The update describes the increasingly sectarian nature of the conflict, something that we have indicated in previous reports, but now is much more clear and confirmed, with government forces and supporting militia attacking Sunni civilians, and reports of anti-government armed groups attacking Alawites and other pro-government minority communities, including Christians, Armenians, Orthodox, and Druze.
So, Peter Harling, what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the conflict between the opposition and the regime is to an extent sectarian, because the opposition is predominantly, although not exclusively, Sunni Arab, whereas the regime is predominantly Alawites, especially today, given the fact that the Alawites represent a strong constituency within its apparatus of repression. Now, it's above all a political conflict between the two. Now, what we're seeing is really a pattern of incidents within society itself. And increasingly, armed groups are being radicalized, not necessarily according to a jihadi outlook, but they are increasingly brutal in some of their tactics and engaging in violence against other components of society and not simply the regime.
So you see this still as as a political conflict primarily. It's not a sectarian conflict for you.
Well,
above all else.
I see a risk of new fault lines, new conflicts igniting as the regime is forced into a fighting retreat in that vacuum which is appearing in some parts of the country. And as I said, there's a pattern of incidents. So you can describe them as isolated incidents, but they are adding up. Clashes between Arabs and Kurds in the north. You've had some bomb attacks in the predominantly Druze quarter of Jaramana in Damascus. Now there's some friction with some Christian militias west of Hama in central Syria, and so on and so forth. These incidents are still the exception, but we see more and more of them, and I think it's a very worrying trend.
Where does that lead in terms of inheriting a post-Assad Syria if he goes with no sort of overarching identity or identities that have been radicalized over so many months of conflict?
Well, that's really the question today. I think we're at a crossroads between a relatively rough landing and a plane crash, basically. Here the risk, as I see it, is the destruction of the capital if the opposition seeks to destroy the regime militarily rather than go for some kind of political solution, try to address this challenge politically rather than simply let the military dynamics play out. I see a risk, as I said, of other conflicts igniting in other parts of the country. So this could lead the opposition into a Pyrrhic victory. It might ultimately defeat the regime, but at such a cost that this society would take years and years to recover.
What's your reading at the moment of whether the opposition wants to go through with this militarily to the end rather than perhaps go for some political negotiations once it can see that the regime is much further weakened?
Well, in theory, the political opposition wants to be recognized as the legitimate representative of Syrian society, of the Syrian people. In practice, they are essentially beholden to those armed groups on the ground that are in the lead in this struggle against the regime. that's where legitimacy on the opposition side is really vested. Those are the people who have martyrs, who are sacrificing themselves. And it's very difficult for the opposition in exile to go against these fighters on the ground. Now, that's one component of society which has been radicalized by this conflict, and the opposition is not really addressing the fears of a large part of Syrian society, which doesn't know whether to loathe the regime or the opposition most. And obviously it doesn't address the fears of all those who are still fighting for the regime, not because they believe the regime will win, not because they necessarily support Bashar as such, but believe deep down that they will be slaughtered when the regime collapses, and are holding together, closing ranks as a result of what they see as an opposition of eradicators.
I'm not quite clear about the relationship there between, you're talking about a sort of silent majority, am I right? Sort of that is neither pro-government nor pro-opposition particularly, but I'm not clear what the linkage is between that and the political opposition in exile.
Well, the opposition in exile needs to take some positions on key issues, and in particular describe its vision for the state. You know, what to do of the military, the army institution in this country, given the role it's played in this conflict. What to do about the Ba'ath Party? Should it be dismantled, everyone sent home? The security services, will they be reformed? Are any of their elements susceptible to be integrated into a new power structure? Or will we see a repeat of what we saw in Iraq with a decision to dismantle the whole, the regime comprehensively? Transitional justice, to take just one example, it's time for the opposition to start narrowing down who will be held accountable. For the time being, if you follow their statements, everyone will. Recently, just 2 weeks ago, one slogan was general amnesty for all those who support the regime but have no blood on their hands. It's hard to understand what kind of a message the opposition is trying to get across if they describe just supporting the regime as a crime and assert that all those who are involved one way or another in the repression will be held accountable. That's the best way of keeping the regime together and ensuring that it will go down fighting, which has every chance of causing far more destruction still than we've seen in this country.
So far the Syrian National Council is really basically not clear in its message, but isn't it just expecting too much of them to act as a government in exile while there's this turmoil happening actually inside the country?
Well, if they want to be recognized as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people, I think there are responsibilities that come along with that title, and they need to broaden their base to try and build their own credibility within this society, rather than simply catering for those who are in the lead in terms of the military struggle.
Pete Harling, you've been to Syria many times, and you were there just 10 days ago. Through your contacts with people in the Syrian regime, what do you think their mood is right now?
I think some people are still in denial, others are quite lucid, see the writing on the wall. But essentially, I think the reason why this regime is still holding together, and we see no defection that really goes to the heart of what this regime has become. We don't see, whole military units turning against the regime at this stage, although it's rather late in the day. The reason why this regime is holding together is because those who still compose it have nowhere to go, are convinced deep down that they will be slaughtered, and as a result, believe they might as well fight to the end.
So some of your contacts have been open about saying, we realize that the end is a question of time.
Well, they weren't that open suddenly, but there's a realization, I think, on both sides of this conflict now that we're not in a stalemate anymore. The regime has done much of what it could do to face off the opposition. Its allies have done much of what they could do, whereas the opposition is still building up and showing potential for more.
What do you think Farouk al-Shara really meant when he said neither side can win? What's your sense of what was behind, or how should we read that statement?
Well, I think it was a realistic assessment of where things are at. The opposition can ultimately defeat this regime but in doing so will probably lead to this destruction of the capital, could push the regime into a corner, and you know that could lead the regime to start firing its stockpiles of missiles into all the areas it will lose control of. Not to mention, you know, all this speculation about chemical weapons, but his assessment is that there's a need to go back to a political track. I think he would push for negotiations between the two sides. I think at a minimum what's expected of the opposition is to start addressing the political issues which have been raised in this conflict and fleshing out their vision for the future, taking positions that can reassure as broad a cross-section of Syrian society as possible, rather than simply pushing to topple the regime as if that will solve all problems, and as if all those problems could be left for later on.
So much work for the political opposition to make its case to the Syrian people. I'll have to end it there. Thank you very much for being on the show. Peter Harling from the International Crisis Group, the country director for Syria, Lebanon and Egypt. And do check out upcoming interviews on France 24 that I'll be conducting by looking at my Twitter handle, which is @ArmandGeorgian. Thanks for watching France 24 and do stay tuned.